Today we break down Dylan Johnson's training plan. We get into the weeds. Macro cycles, meso cycles, tapering. Is there a place for strength training? You're going to love this podcast. There's so many great takeaways. Welcome to the Roadman Podcast, Mr. Dylan Johnson. Dylan Johnson, welcome back to the Roadman Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
We chatted a little bit at Roller Live. We got to hang out for the first time, but I don't think we didn't really get into the intricacies of planning, macro cycles, mesocycles, all this stuff. So I'm curious, you're someone who is meticulous in almost every aspect of cycling. And I wanted to lift the hood a little bit today on what your preparation for a season looks like. How early do you start mapping out your season, and what's that process look like?
How early do I start mapping it out? I mean, I think as soon as the last race of the previous season ends. So when Big Sugar ended, I got home and I was already thinking about what I was going to do for the next season. But that doesn't mean I start preparing the second I get home. Like I let myself have a bit of an off season, and there is probably a 2-month period where I'm mostly focusing on weightlifting and just kind of gradually easing back into cycling. So I do give myself an off season. I don't just jump straight back into it right when I get back home.
A lot of business analysts, they'll use kind of like a SWOT analysis where they like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. I've never really heard a formal structure like that applied to a cycling season looking back in retrospect. But is that something you do consciously or unconsciously, where you're analysing and figuring out where the gaps are from the previous season and how to improve upon them?
Certainly. I mean, I think that for anybody who follows me, they know that a big weakness of mine is my sprint. And I do lose quite a bit of sprints when it comes down to some sort of sprint finish. That's something that I've definitely been trying to address this off season. I've been doing sprints twice a week, pretty much every week since January, trying to improve that. And I don't actually think that I have terrible sprint numbers. I can do 1,300 watts on fresh legs, but
that's pretty good.
Maybe it's just at the end of a long gravel race. I'm more tired than the people around me, or what, I don't know. But usually at the end of a long gravel race, I'd be lucky to crack 1,000.
Yeah, that's pretty poor. So, so then it's like, it's almost, how do you go about the diagnostic part of improving that sprint? Because it doesn't seem like it's a top end force production issue. It more seems like, is it total glycogen depletion, or is it just a lack of fatigue resilience later in it that's depleting the sprint?
Yeah, I think there could be a number of things. For one, I never raced on the road, so I don't have as much practice sprinting as some of these road racers do. I came from mountain biking, and usually in mountain bike races, you don't have to sprint your opponent, or if you do, you're sprinting one or two other people. You're not sprinting a pack. So I think sometimes my timing can be a bit off, but even when I have the timing correct, I talked about this recently in a video of mine about durability, and durability meaning your ability to produce power late into a race. Could be with any given number of efforts. It could be a 20-minute effort, could be a 5-minute effort, and it could be a sprint. They've found that successful sprinters, they don't necessarily have higher power outputs than anybody else. I mean, it's probably a bit higher, but if we're talking about equivalent people that are gifted in sprinting, what makes them successful is that they're able to reproduce that power number very late into a race. And when we're talking about sprinting, we're talking about literally the end of the race. They're able to reproduce those power numbers at the end of the race. So I work on that in training. I actually don't usually do my sprints with fresh legs. Sometimes I do, but I usually do my sprints after I've already done the workout and I've got tired legs.
There's less of an efficiency component, I think, in gravel sprinting as well, because you're typically sprinting from a group of 10 or less. If you think about pack sprinting in a road race, like I'm sure you've done high level road races, even though your terms, you're not an accomplished road racer. You're still, that last 5 kilometers you're making so many 10-second, 20-second, 30-second efforts to close gaps, be in the right position, move up. You're out in the wind slightly. You're trying to lean on someone, open a little gap. You're into that. So you're operating at like 4 beats below max for a long time in that last 4 or 5 kilometers. And then you're trying to produce the effort. And the great sprinters, like I chatted to Alex Dowsett this morning, and we are talking a little bit about Cavendish. The great sprinters seem to be so efficient in that last 4 to 5 kilometers. They're putting out far fewer efforts than their peers and preserving a little bit more of that top end speed. But would I be right to say that's not as much of a consideration in a gravel finish?
I would say it really depends on the race. A gravel finish will almost always be fewer riders. So we're not talking about sprinting a peloton. We're talking about sprinting 5 riders, 10 riders, could be less than that. But we're talking about a small group. So it's more of the kind of sprint that you would see at the end of a classics race, where it's a small group sprinting. Yeah. And there's a lot of cat and mouse tactics that can happen. Somebody's probably going to try to do a flyer, or everybody just sits up and actually waits until the sprint happens. Although I will say that can be kind of rare because people get antsy. But yeah, it's less of that road race style, and I would say that it's more. It can be more cat and mouse. It can be more tactical because we're talking about a group of fewer people.
If I had some sprint advice for you, it'd be don't go to the line with Greg Van Avermaet this season. It's just never going to end well for you.
Yeah, if you watch that footage of Unbound, I mean, it wasn't even. I think the group that I was sprinting with was 5 or 6 riders. It wasn't even close. I mean, he was basically not even in the photo finish, even though he sprinted.
Yeah,
us.
like if that's a stage race, he's getting a time gap. He's like 3 seconds ahead.
Yeah.
When a lot of us think about our season and we're setting it up and we zoom out, Dan Lorang, who's the head coach for Bora, he gave me this idea of looking at your calendar. And before we start talking about planning in ABC races, he plans out like obligations that you can't miss, even for his World Tour athletes. So he put in like, okay, I'm getting married here, daughter's getting born here, whatever these things are. And I thought, that's actually a really nice way to approach a season setup, is to put the non-negotiables in first. And then for me, I use that kind of ABC priority races. Do you use that like naming structure of ABC priority races? And if so, how many A races can you focus on in a year?
Yeah, I use ABC. A races for me is usually 2 or 3 races a year. For this coming season, Unbound is undoubtedly an A race. And then I would say the second A race is either going to be Leadville or it'll be Big Sugar.
Nice. And what's the decision making as to why not to throw a third A race in? The spacing of the races?
I mean, it could be 3. I could go for Unbound, Leadville, and Big Sugar. I do sometimes feel that I struggle at the end of a long season, and the Lifetime Grand Prix season is quite long. Last year, Big Sugar was actually my worst performance of the Lifetime GP season, and I think it's a course that I can do well at if I prepare well for it. So I'd like to give that one a good crack. And the Leadville being at altitude and being so much climbing, I don't think I can do moderately well there, but I'm never going to have a standout performance there, I don't think.
You're not going for that Keegan record. See, he's living in Utah, isn't he?
He's in Utah, yeah. I mean, he is an absolute genetic freak at altitude. He's a genetic freak in general, but at altitude, it's crazy how good he is at altitude. And I would say that if I had to give a percentage, I'd say there's a 98% chance that Keegan will win Leadville for the foreseeable future.
Did Cape Epic give you a little bit of hope that maybe it's not the best Keegan coming into this season?
Yeah, Cape Epic, it's hard to say because there's so many factors at Cape Epic. I think Keegan's back was bothering him. If he gets that sorted out, I think he'll be fine. We had quite a chat about whether Keegan is done or not on the Bonk Bros podcast. You know, I don't know. I don't know if you can use Cape Epic as a metric there because it's quite a different style of race to a 1 day lifetime GP race. Although what I will say is that if there was ever a year in the lifetime GP for another rider to take it on the men's side, it would be this year, because Keegan's early season form at Cape Epic might not have been the strongest. And also, they've taken out 2 altitude races. They've taken out Crusher, and then they've taken out the Rad. And like I said, Keegan's a genetic freak at altitude. So if there's an altitude race, he's probably the one who's going to win. Yeah, I would say it's going to be a more interesting year than it has in the past 3 years.
Yeah, and even we know the economics of gravel racing have been highly lucrative for the top riders in the past few years as well. And Keegan has been the top dog for like 4 years now. Like, it gets difficult to, what's the old cliche, like hard to get out and run the miles when you're sleeping in the silk sheets.
Yeah, I don't think that Keegan has that issue. Keegan puts in the work regardless, but yes, that's a good point.
Periodization models, few theories floating around: reverse periodization, standard periodization. I interestingly chatted to Professor Stephen Seiler on it, and he was talking about a big study he ran where they looked at 3 different types of standard periodization, reverse periodization, or randomly allocated intensity. And he said there's no difference in response in either 3 of the models. Do you have a preference for either 3, or do you agree with him on that?
I know exactly what study you're talking about. I've referenced that in my own videos. I usually like my training to get more specific to racing as I get closer to racing. So I usually go with standard periodization, I would say. Some could argue that you would want to do reverse periodization for a race like Unbound, since it's such a long race. But I think we chatted about this last year. Unbound is getting more spicy every single year. So I felt like we were hitting 400, 500 watts on every single little roller of Unbound last year. So I used to say that it was a race where as long as you could hold tempo power for 10 hours, you're good. But I don't know if that's the case anymore. I think it's getting punchier. It's never going to be as punchy as a standard road race, but it's definitely getting punchier.
So are you looking at the demands of that race, and then you're trying to reverse engineer the demands of that race and build them into your training in the weeks and months leading up to it?
Yeah, I would say so. When we're talking about periodization, you talk about reverse periodization, standard periodization, mixed. I want to throw block periodization in there because that's been one of my big things for the past, I would say, 2 or 3 years now. And standard block periodization uses intensity. So for those who don't know what block periodization is, it's just where you have a higher training load in, let's say, 1 week. You have a higher training load in 1 week, and then you recover from that afterwards for the rest of the month. So in a lot of the studies on block periodization, they might have subjects do 2 high intensity workouts a week every week for a month. That's the control group. And then the block periodization group, they've got 5 high intensity workouts in the first week, and then 1 high intensity workout every week after that. So they're really blocking the training load together in 1 week as opposed to spreading it out evenly over time. I have done that. I think that works well, but I've actually been using block periodization with volume, not intensity, and I've been having great success with it, probably because the races that I do are high volume, especially Unbound. And so this year, I've actually kind of doubled down on that. And then if I were to describe what kind of training I've been doing over the past couple of months here, I would call it block periodization. I wouldn't necessarily call it traditional or reverse.
So how big is it? 1 block every 4 weeks?
I've experimented with different ways to arrange it. I've done a 1 week block every 4 weeks. I've done a 2 week, like for Unbound last year, I did a 2 week block with a 3 week taper, if you want to call it that, although it wasn't quite that. So 2 weeks on, 3 weeks in leading into the race of recovery. This year, what I've been doing, and I guess I call it oscillation training because you're oscillating between really high volume and really low volume. So I'll just do a week of super high volume and then a week of pretty low volume. So for me, that's like 30 to 35 hours in a week. And then the next week might be 10 to 15. And then 30 to 35 and then 10 to 15. And then 30 to 35 and then 10 to 15.
And how do you approach intensity on the, assumably there's very little intensity on the high week. On the lower week, do you ramp intensity up when volume goes down?
Yeah, so in January and February when I wasn't that fit, there was very little intensity in those weeks, but I will say that recently I don't ramp down intensity during those weeks. I actually have high intensity, not super high intensity. I'll just have 2 intensity days in the week, but those are standard high intensity days. Like those are the kind of intensity days I would be doing if I was doing a standard volume week. And I think because you're coming into that week in a fresh state, you're able to do that. If you're coming into the week in a fatigued state, that might be very difficult to even complete that workout. Yeah. So I'll do 2 high intensity workouts in that week along with the high volume, and that makes for a very high training load for that week. But you know that you're going to have a very low training load the next week. So there's always light at the end of the tunnel.
It's almost like a super compensation stage race type adaptation you're getting from it.
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, there's different ideas around why block periodization might be helpful, but that's certainly one of them.
What's the leading thoughts on the gap? Like you're on, as you say, oscillating from high volume week to low volume week. Is that the gold standard, or are people leaning more towards 1 week, 3 weeks easier, 2 weeks easier?
Yeah, this is not the gold standard at all. This is me. This is me going into the darkness here. There's not even really good research on this oscillation theory that I have. It's more so just me doubling down on what has worked for me in the past, which has been this block periodization approach. I don't know a single study that says do a high volume week, do a low volume week, do a high volume week, do a low volume week. This is really me going into the darkness here. But I will say, the Lifetime GP hasn't kicked off yet, so I don't know whether this is actually going to be a good approach or a bad approach, but I'm willing to experiment on myself with it. What I will say from early power numbers is that I've been hitting some of the highest power numbers I've ever seen. So I don't know. We'll just have to see what happens. A caveat with that is that I'm also heavier than I have been in years past, but the watts per kilo is pretty much the same, and then the raw watts is higher.
Yeah, I was going to ask here, is this oscillation, I love that name because it's like a trading tool for finance pros as well. Uh-huh. Is this oscillation theory, are you backing this up with specific testing protocols? Are you testing lactates, critical power numbers, anything like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the big thing that I've been into recently is durability and testing durability. I did a durability test recently where I did a 20-minute power test at the beginning of the ride, and then I rode for 5 or I think it was a 6-hour ride total, and I did a 20-minute test at the end of the ride to see.
Brutal ride.
Yeah, it's a brutal ride. Fortunately, I had my teammate Adam Roberge there to do it with me, so we kind of psyched each other up for both of those. And we did the tests together, and we started 30 seconds apart so that we could chase one another.
Italian pursuit, we call that on the track.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of made it sort of fun as a 20-minute test could be. But I've been big into that, and there's actually research to suggest that your fatigued 20-minute power, 5-minute power, whatever you want to test, but basically your durability is more important than your fresh numbers, which is where that infamous thumbnail that I think a lot of people took out of context, FTP doesn't matter, that's where that came from. I'm not saying FTP doesn't matter, but I would say that durability actually matters more than FTP, which if you actually watch the video, you get the nuance of it. But I do realize that the thumbnail was quite inflammatory for some people.
Hey everybody, let's take a quick break to talk about the bike I'll be riding this season, Reap. I've been lucky enough to ride all the top brands in the world over the past few years, but these Reap bikes, they're not the same, and I'll tell you why. Reap is the first company I've seen that isn't chasing sales targets and the mass market. They're chasing something very rare: perfection. Every bike they make, it's crafted in the UK factory, and it's not about slapping a Made in Britain label on a bike from a Chinese factory. It's about control. From the first sketch to the final build, they're hands-on, ensuring that every detail is dialed in. That's very rare in an outsourced world of mass production. What sets them apart is innovation. While others pump out the same old designs, Reap's pushing boundaries. They're not following trends, they're setting trends. Think precision and performance, like an F1 car for the road. Absolutely no compromises. And it shows, and you can feel it when you ride the bikes. These bikes are built for riders who demand the best, whether they're chasing podiums or just want a machine that feels like an extension of your body, a piece of art. It's not hype, it's substance. Ride a Reap for yourself, and you're riding something crafted with intent. So if you're serious about cycling, check them out. It's reapbikes.com. I absolutely love my one, and I couldn't recommend it highly enough. Back to the show. But this was always my thesis and basically why I quit cycling. I was training with friends who were world tour, and I could do some pretty decent numbers. Like I had a 427 at 68 kilograms for 27 minutes, I think was my best around that. It's a decent test, but it was fresh. It was in a hill climb championships. But what I noticed, my buddies who were world tour, they were putting out the same, if not better, watts per kilograms, but they were able to do it at the end of a 6 or 7 hour ride. Like I remember one particular friend, he was riding for Sky at the time, and 5-minute efforts up to the local coffee shop that we used to finish on. Like he was still putting out 550 watts after 5 hour rides, and I was having like 150 to 200 watt drop off in my 5-minute power at the end of the rides. And I was like, this, I didn't have that word for it. I didn't know it was durability. I was like fatigue resistance, whatever you want to call it. It was so different between the tip of the spear guys and me. And I was like, I'm never getting there. I'm packing this in.
Yeah, and you know what the difficult thing about durability too is that people might ask, okay, well, how do I develop my durability? And I think the answer that people don't want to hear is that it takes years to develop durability, and it takes a lot of volume, and it takes a lot of it's essentially there's not a shortcut to developing durability. It takes a lot of hard work over years, and that's what it is. I mean, I think part of the reason why, and I said this in my video, you see some junior riders with watts per kilo numbers that would rival that of World Tour riders, especially because they're light, so they have a high watts per kilo. The reason why they don't do well in a pro race is because oftentimes junior riders have terrible durability. They just haven't had the time to develop that durability yet.
Yeah.
And that really seems to be the key.
So how big was your drop off between test 1 and test 2 that day?
Yeah, so in the first 20-minute test, I did 4:14 for 20 minutes, and then in the second test, I did 4:01 for 20 minutes.
Very good.
Yeah, no, I was very pleased with it, especially because the first test was the highest 20-minute power I'd ever seen, and then the second test equaled the highest power I'd ever seen in a fresh state up to that point. So I was very pleased with it.
I had a merch idea. You can join it. It's just called the 400 Club. And you can do 400 plus for 20
400
minutes.
Club, yeah.
It's a pretty exclusive club.
Yeah, yeah.
You've got to be, like, you can't be too light as well. Like, you're pretty light, but there's two ways to get in there. Just be a good bike rider or just be massive.
Just be. So you need an even more exclusive club, which is the 6 Club. 6 watts per kilo.
Nah. Fuck those guys. You mentioned strength training at the start. How often are you strength training? And is that a year round or is that seasonal?
Yeah, it is seasonal for me. I talk a lot about strength training in my videos, and so I attract some people who are huge fans of strength training, and sometimes they get on me about not strength training all year long. But what I will say is that once the season really hits, it gets quite hard to actually maintain strength training all year, just because these gravel races, you got to taper into the race, so you don't want to have any soreness in your legs leading into the race, so you might not lift the week of the race. And then after the race, I mean, it's just all about trying to get out of that fatigue hole. Like
Yeah.
you might have raced for 7 or 8 hours, and it's not you're not going to feel good in 2 or 3 days, and you're certainly not going to feel good to go bust out some squats in 2 or 3 days. You could do it, but you might be in that hole for way longer than you should be.
I think the part the keyboard warriors miss is we need to be clear on what we're optimizing for. You're optimizing for performance. So it doesn't make sense to throw in strength training when you're trying to recover, get the adaptation from a long race, recover, get ready for the next race. But if you're optimizing for health, for longevity, then maybe it does make sense. It most likely does make sense to continue that strength training all the way around. But a lot of us look at World Tour riders or we look at gravel pros and analyze your behavior and then think, well, that's what we should be doing. But I'm optimizing for something totally different than you are.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that when I eventually retire from pro racing, I will probably lift all year long, and I will probably also do a lot more upper body lifting than I currently do. I'm not saying I completely ignore my upper body, but when I go into the gym, my legs are my focus.
So when you're in the gym, are you optimizing for hypertrophy? Are you optimizing for max strength or something else?
The type of lifts that I do, people would call them optimizing for maximum strength. It's usually a low rep range, and I give myself plenty of rest between sets too. And the reason I do that, I'm open to the idea that a higher rep range could also be helpful. I'm not saying it's not, but the research that we currently have on weight training for cycling and the studies almost always show that strength training improves cycling performance. They're usually operating in a pretty low rep range. We're talking about under 10 reps.
Have you got tangible on the bike gains from strength training, or is it more about injury prevention, durability?
I would say it's about tangible gains in the amount of power you can produce. I can talk about my own experience. I usually don't talk about my own experience on my channel because I like to keep it very science based, and your own
Yeah.
experience is just an N of one. So, but if I talk about my own experience, I started strength training when I was 21 years old. So I didn't strength train at all as a teenager. And but even though I was a competitive cyclist as a teenager, I didn't strength train at all. I started at 21. That year that I went from 20 years old to 21, I made a massive jump in my fitness. And that could have been due to a lot of things. I mean, at 21 years old, you're still developing. So it's not unheard of to make massive jumps in fitness in the 20 to 23-year-old age range. But I will say that that year that I started strength training was a massive boost in performance for me. So take that with what it is.
Yeah, it is interesting. Look at, as you say, those N01 studies are sometimes interesting observationally, but rarely give us too much insight. Talking to the World Tour physiologists is interesting because everyone wants to know, well, show me the peer-reviewed data. But they don't care about peer-reviewed data. They care about the N01 when the N01 is Primoz Roglic. So they don't
Yeah.
care about the effect of ketones on 200 double-blind participants. They care about, can we preserve a little bit of glycogen for Roglic in the last hour of a Tour de France stage? When you're looking at coming out of one of these blocks and you're heading into an A priority race, you're heading into Unbound, Leadville, whatever it is, how are you tracking your taper? Are you using metrics, using training stress balance and trying to get it back close to a zero? Are you monitoring heart rate variability, subjective feelings?
There was a while where I wore a whoop strap, and I looked at heart rate variability. I actually don't wear a whoop strap or measure heart rate variability anymore because I don't know. I found that the results that I got from it were inconsistent with how I actually felt. And as far as using training stress balance, I mean, I do use that. I try to make sure that I'm in probably positive 10 to positive 15 training stress balance for race day, sometimes positive 20, somewhere in there. But, you know, you talk about using feeling and perceived exertion, I think that is what I use more than anything during a taper week. And my taper week is not set in stone. So let's say I've got a Saturday race and it's Monday. What I do in the next 5 days will pretty much be determined by how I feel in the morning and how I feel when I get on the bike. So if I wake up Monday and I'm smoked, I'll probably rest. If I wake up Tuesday and I'm smoked, I'll probably do an easy ride. If I wake up Wednesday and I feel like I'm ready to go, I'll probably do an interval session, not a full interval session, but a reduced interval session, just kind of more as openers. And I will even do those openers based on feel. That's probably the only time I do intervals based on feel, but I'll just ride hard and see how it feels. Not go too deep. I'd say probably go 90%, leave some in the tank. But that entire week is based off of feel. And I think there's an optimal level of fatigue going into a race. You actually don't want to be too fresh. You can be too fresh going into a race. And you can obviously be too fatigued. And I think there's an optimal level. And through experience, I know what optimally fatigued should feel like going into a race. So if it's Thursday or Friday and I feel like I'm too fresh or I'm too fatigued, I will change what I do on those days to try to get to that optimal level of fatigue by race day.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm with you on the wearables. I play around with going back and forth, using them and not using them. It seems like, chatting with your John Wakefields, your Dan Lorangs, the top coaches, that like the trifecta seems to be that subjective analysis of how an athlete feels in themselves, the Training Peaks data, and then marrying that with a wearable and taking the three of those. I'm not sure if you're giving a weight to each of those. I would suggest that it's probably more weight to subjectively how you feel rather than the other two. But I think we could potentially be on the precipice of an exciting frontier with AI being able to analyze mass trials of Training Peak data and Whoop data over longer periods of time and give us recommendations on what optimum skin temperature, heart rate variability, sleep scores look like when you're performing at your best. I think we're getting some interesting stuff happening in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what put me on to trying the Whoop in the first place was there is actually research. I believe that they had a study, and it's been a really long time since I've looked at the study, so I don't know who performed the study in it, and I don't know the exact details of it because I made this video probably 4 years ago at this point. But they had subjects do a pre-planned training plan, and then they had subjects do a training plan based on their HRV. So if their HRV was high, they would do intervals. If their HRV was medium, they would just do an endurance ride, and if their HRV was low, they would not do anything. It would be a recovery day. So whatever HRV they had in the morning, that dictated what they did that day. And it turned out that the group that trained based off of HRV outperformed the group that had a preset training plan.
That's
and I thought that was super interesting. Yeah. I was like, well, that could totally revolutionize training. And I guess what happened is that in practice, I just didn't find that to be the case with myself. There were days where I woke up, I was in the red, and I went out and I completely smashed my intervals. And I was like, well, it's a good thing I didn't listen to the Whoop. And then there were days where I'd wake up and I was in the green and I was just slogging on the bike. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's even how I had Marco Altini, who's one of the pioneers in heart rate variability, on the podcast, and it's even the way some of the devices capture it, like Garmin or Whoop capture it. He academically objects to how that's captured. He's like, heart rate variability needs to be a moment in time where you're like, okay, I'm going to take my heart rate variability for the day now. And you're making sure you're not sneezing, you're not breathing, you're not coughing. It's a very specific formula you need to go through and taking the heart rate at that moment. The straps are taking it at random points during the night. And he's like, so you're getting a random snapshot that maybe doesn't represent even what that hour is like. It could be an anomaly inside that hour. So he just doesn't think it's there yet in terms of the capture. But you're balancing, like the way he advocates capturing it is he built an app out. I think it's called HRV for training, for numerical for training. But it's finger over the lens of your camera. And that's like, there's still some good data, and that's the best way to do it, but it's massively inconvenient. So you're balancing convenience against maybe poorer data with the straps like Whoop and Garmin. I don't know where the answer on it lies.
I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you've ever worn a Whoop or one of the other HRV monitors, if you've ever woken up in the morning and had a certain HRV score and then gone back to bed for an hour or two, and then you wake up and you have a completely different HRV score. You could wake up and then you'd be, I don't know, in the red, and then you go back to bed for 2 hours, and now you're in the yellow, or maybe even in the green. There were a couple times where I did that, because sometimes when I wake up and I feel really tired and I feel like I didn't get a good night's sleep and I have nothing to do that morning, I will just go back to bed. And there were a couple times where I did that, and the second time I woke up, granted, they're taking into account the amount of sleep you get, I realize this, but there were a couple times where I did that where my HRV score was completely different on the second reading.
It's like you just keep going until you get an outcome you like. It's like that magic 8 ball. You're shaking. It's like outcome so.
Yeah.
We couldn't have you on the podcast without talking nerdy tech stuff, and everyone's always curious and clamoring for their online retailer to figure out what tires you're using for next season. You were a Pathfinder geek for quite a while, and you've moved away. What's in vogue this year? What are you thinking of rocking?
Yeah, so I think last year was the year that the mountain bike tire in gravel racing really took off, and I expect it will be no different this year. And I think at this point last year, almost no one was using mountain bike tires for gravel racing. If you look at Sea Otter is happening in 2 weeks at the point of actually not even 2 weeks, a week and a half. At the point of recording this, I bet you the Lifetime Grand Prix field at Sea Otter, I bet 2/3 of them are on mountain bike tires at this point for a gravel race, not the mountain bike race, for a gravel race.
So unpack that a little bit for me. How much of that is the standard is quite good? You're not getting separation as early in these races, so you're in the wheel at higher speeds. People aren't calling potholes. There's holes everywhere. A flat effectively takes you out of the race. How much of it is robustness against flat versus rolling resistance, efficiency, aerodynamics?
Yeah, well, it depends on which rider you ask. Like if you ask somebody like Alexi Vermeulen, he will tell you the only reason he runs mountain bike tires is so that he doesn't flat, which good enough. At least he's embracing it. But if you ask someone like me, I think that even hypothetically, if the race was a time trial and you could have clear sight of your line the entire time, I would still run mountain bike tires for a gravel race like Unbound, because almost the entire thing is gravel. And so let's unpack that a little bit. There's a very specific reason why I go with mountain bike tires and not just oversized gravel tires. And we did a little bit of this testing at Silverstone when I was over in the UK.
Rule 28.
Yeah, with Rule 28. It was very generous of them to support that testing, because Rule 28 does not sell tires. They don't have anything to do with tires. They just have a passion for making people go fast. So they helped me out with that testing, and huge thank you to them. So we use their pedaling efficiency rig. They've got a pavement surface and a cobbled surface. They don't have a gravel surface, but we use the cobbled surface to approximate a gravel surface. And we tested 35, 40, 45, 50, and then a 55 millimeter mountain bike tire. And we found that the mountain bike tire when the mountain bike tire was slower on pavement, as you would expect, you got on cobbles, the mountain bike tire blew the gravel tires out of the water. And that testing that we did on the rig backs up the testing that I've done in real life. I've tested this in real life on gravel, and I found the exact same thing. And I think that there's a reason for that, and it's because mountain bike tires utilize a thinner casing. And usually a thinner casing tire means a lower rolling resistance. And the reason why they can get away with a thinner casing is because the tire is so wide. If you actually put that thinner casing on a 40, you're going to flat.
Yeah.
it's inevitable. You're gonna flat. So in order to have a casing that thin, you need a tire that wide. And I think you could actually make the argument too that the tread of the mountain bike tire is also helping to protect the thin casing.
Is it tire dependent? Did you test different mountain bike tires and brands?
So when we were at Silverstone, we didn't test different mountain bike tires. We only tested the Race King. I've tested different mountain bike tires, and it is tire dependent. I mean, there are definitely slow mountain bike tires out there. You don't want to just throw any old mountain bike tire on there and call it good. There are slow mountain bike tires, just like there's slow gravel tires and fast gravel tires. My personal recommendation right now is what I use is I'll use the Conti Race King for a race that is particularly chunky or a race where I'm worried about flatting. So that would be Unbound, Big Sugar. Those are races where there are a lot of punctures and there's quite chunky sections. And I use the Race King because I feel like it's got a little bit better flat protection, and it's a 2.2, so it's wide by gravel standards. And then if there's less of a risk of flatting or it's smoother gravel, I'll usually go with the Schwalbe Thunderbird 2.1.
Transform your indoor cycling with Ruvi, the platform that brings real-world routes and augmented reality to your training. Whether you're preparing for a big event or you're just looking to explore, Ruvi lets you experience legendary rides like Alpe d'Huez and Passo di Stelvio from the comfort of your home. Ruvi's unique augmented reality technology uses real-life video and GPS data to create the most realistic cycling experience available. You'll feel every climb, descent, and turn with precise terrain replication, giving you an authentic outdoor ride indoors. Plus, with AR elements like avatars and banners, the ride really feels totally immersive and interactive. With over 1,500 routes and 25,000 kilometers, the world's most iconic cycling destinations, Ruvi is perfect for cyclists of all levels. Whether you want to enjoy scenic routes, participate in group rides, or push your limits with advanced training plans, Ruvi has you covered. Ruvi also offers flexible pricing, allowing you to pause your subscription or choose duo or group plans to share the experience. From exploring new places to serious training, Ruvi has something for every cyclist. Ready to ride the world? Visit ruvi.com and start your journey today. Actually, before I ask that question, I just reminded of, I was chatting to Alex Dowsett this morning, and we were talking about aerodynamics. He's working with Astana now and helping out with their aerodynamics. And one of the things we were talking about is there's not objectively in road and time trial anymore a fastest tire. There's a fastest tire, wheel, bike, rider system. That the totality of it matters. Is that still the case in gravel, or we just haven't evolved to that point yet where people are dialed in enough to measure the whole system?
Yeah, it's almost undoubtedly the case in gravel, but we're not at the point in gravel where we're measuring that. So, people in road at the high level, people are taking into account how all of these factors affect each other. I would say in gravel, we're just not at that point yet. We're lingering behind.
You're going to be next year talking about how you've tested 20 different systems in Silverstone. What else is moving the needle for you in terms of the marginal gains?
So I think as far as aerodynamics, and we're talking about tires, but I think you can't talk about tires without talking about wheels. One thing that I'm very excited about this year, I've got a new wheel partner, Duke, and I know this sounds like, okay, this sponsored rider is talking about his sponsored equipment. I'm going to just skip through this part of the video because I roll. But I am genuinely excited about these wheels, and let me quickly explain why. I think that an aero gravel wheel needs to be wide because the tires are wide, and in order for the airflow to stay attached, you want a wide rim. These Duke Aero gravel wheels are 42 mil external rim width, but they don't go crazy on the internal rim width, which I think is the mistake that Zip made with their Explore 303 wheel. They went too crazy on the internal rim width, and it's causing people to burp the tire and having issues there. They went 28 mil on the internal rim width and then 42 on the external rim width. So very wide on the external, still wide on the internal, but not crazy. I've been riding those wheels for about a month or a month and a half now, and I like them a lot. I haven't actually had them in the wind tunnel, but that is something that I plan to put to the test in the wind tunnel. Last year, Silk and I tested wheel depth in the wind tunnel, and we found that deeper was in fact faster, even with wider tires. But now we want to test width. How much of a difference does width make when you have wide tires?
It seems like everyone agrees that wider is better on tires at the moment. I've heard very few dissenting voices on this. So few frames are able to take over 47 mil tires. Why the disparity between what manufacturers are making and what the industry seems to be telling us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a 2 or 3 year lag between whatever the current trend is, and then companies actually coming out with a frame that represents that trend. So, you're saying everybody's on this wide tire trend. You go back a year, 2 years, not everybody was on this wide tire trend. I would say, especially, I feel like I have my finger on the pulse of this trend because I was such an early adopter to wide tires, and I feel like I've been banging my head against the wall trying to tell people that wide tires are faster. As I've already said in this podcast, if you go back 12 months, no one had mountain bike tires on their gravel bike. So it's really been a trend within the last year that people are starting to go bigger than 47. 47 used to be the biggest anyone would go. Yeah. And it's only in the last year that people are going 50, 52, 55 millimeter mountain bike tire. So it really is a recent trend. And I do think that the next iteration of gravel bikes from every single company, if the company is smart, should be able to fit mountain bike tires, because if they're ignoring this trend, then I don't know, they're not doing their job, in my opinion.
But does it start to change? Can you engineer these 55 clearance without changing the Q factor on the bottom bracket?
I mean,
just one or two brands have done it.
It's gonna be difficult. It definitely can be done. There are brands right now that have claimed tire clearance of 50 mil, and it just an FYI, if it says claimed 50 mil, that probably means you can fit up to a 55. But they can't claim a 55 because they don't want people rubbing their frames and then having warranty issues.
Yeah, I have a Reap on the way, which I think is I could be wrong, and Ben and Martin will kill me, but I think it's a claimed 52 on the gravel bike. So I'm thinking it's probably going to hold a 55.
Yeah, easily. I would say easily. They are not having to do anything wacky with the Q factor. They're doing standard Q factors on those frames. If they actually want, I will say though that if they want to claim tire clearance of 55, which means that you could probably actually fit a 60 in there. I mean, it
starts getting crazy.
It does start getting crazy, and the engineers are going to have to think up ways to make that work. You already run into problems if you want to continue to run 2x with this kind of clearance, because the tire gets so wide that it actually runs into the front derailleur. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Is there any really unsexy little hacks or trends that you're on this year? Anything you're playing around with that's not wax and chains, oversized pulleys, the usual? Like, I'm thinking, is there sleep hygiene, new fuel and stuff, mindfulness, anything?
Unsexy. I mean, this isn't new this year. I've been on this the whole time, but I think the least sexy marginal gain that I do is having a healthy diet.
Like, we laugh, but it's like everyone's looking for a shortcut, aren't they? No one wants to hear that.
Right. I think that some of the diets of high level pros is atrocious.
Shocking.
If I'm being honest, I think that health wise it's just really bad, and sometimes like they get in this mindset of food is fuel and I just need to eat a bunch of white rice and that's it, and it's like carbs on the bike and then carbs and nothing else off the I sometimes I feel like the diets are atrocious, and that maybe the short term effect there's not a short term effect, but I think the long term effect to health is going to be there. But I'm not even just talking about health. I'm talking about performance as well and the ability to recover and longevity in the sport. I think it's actually important to not just look at food as fuel, but look at food as nutrition.
Much more research been done around gut microbiome though, and even
Mm-hmm.
carb utilization depending on the construction of your gut microbiome. And I think we're going to see a lot more innovation around that in the next few years because we're in the fast carb time at the moment where everyone is
Mm-hmm.
just, you know, you chat some of the world tour guys, they're like the hardest part of the job at the moment is just their jaws sore from eating so many grams of rice and pasta when they get in from training. It's
Mm-hmm.
like at a point you got to be thinking like they've no, all they talk about is macros. No one ever mentions any micronutrients. It's like
Mm-hmm.
this pendulum's got to swing.
Yeah, I do. I want to see the pendulum swing, and I think that the pendulum's not going to swing if the only reason to focus on micros is long term health. Pros are just going to ignore that. They're like, who cares about long term health? I'm just
Yeah.
trying to get faster. But I think that there is legitimate arguments to be made that paying attention to micros actually affects performance in the short term. And there are studies that show that there's interesting studies on antioxidants. This is, I made a video on this, and this is probably my lowest view video on my channel, and I think it's so important, and it's sad that nobody's interested in this. But this is a very old video, so that could be part of the reason too. But it was about antioxidants, and what's interesting about antioxidants is that if you take supplemental antioxidants, um, then you often see it hindering adaptation. It will improve recovery, but it may hinder adaptation. Kind of like some of the studies that you see with weightlifters and ice baths. They've done studies with weightlifters and ice baths where they've seen weightlifters did have improved recovery with an ice bath, but they also didn't get as strong at the end of
Yeah.
the study period. So they concluded that it hindered out adaptation. Same thing with supplemental antioxidants. Antioxidants that come from real food, which they also tested, seem to have the best of both worlds. It improved recovery and it did not hinder adaptation. And I made a video about that, and hardly anyone watched it, and I absolutely found it fascinating. So,
Here's a hack for you. Get a full blood panel, stick the results into ChatGPT, ask it to analyze your blood test results for performance using only peer-reviewed data, and it comes back with absolute gold.
mm,
There's a hack for everyone to try.
yeah, I haven't tried that yet.
Dylan, thank you very much for your time. Pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Fun as always.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please click up here. There's another video I know that you're absolutely going to love. And click over here and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our amazing upcoming guests.